we can certainly see the cost of poor education when people lose their ability to look at evidence, analyze it, understand that even if you don't like what it says, that you have to deal with the realities of the world.
The Rational View is a weekly series hosted by me, Dr. Alan Scott, providing a rational, evidence-based perspective on important societal issues.
Produced by Soapbox Media.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Rational View. I'm your host, Dr. Al Scott. In this episode, I'm exploring the story of someone who is known as the father of atomic power, Admiral Hyman Rickover. This episode was based on a suggestion from a listener. Thanks, Loki. Rickover is best known for his role in developing the U.S. nuclear submarine program in the 1950s. His groundbreaking work demonstrates that small modular reactors are a safe and effective method of generating clean, carbon-free energy. Today, I'll be interviewing an author who has recently published a biography of Rickover. If you like what you're hearing, please press like on your podcast app and share it with your friends. Also, feel free to join us on the Rational View Facebook group. Marc Wortman received a doctorate in comparative literature from Princeton University. Dr. Wortman is an independent historian and freelance journalist living in New Haven. He's the author of 4 books on American military and social history. Most recently, Admiral Hyman Rickover, Engineer of Power. As an award-winning freelance journalist, Marc has written for many publications, including Vanity Fair, Smithsonian, Time, Air and Space, and The Daily Beast. He's spoken to audiences around the country and has appeared on CNN, NPR, C-SPAN, BookTV, History Channel, and other broadcast outlets. He's taught at Princeton, Quinnipiac Universities, and a college program at a maximum security prison. He was the recipient of a New York Public Library Research Fellowship and was the 2014 Jalonick Memorial Distinguished Lecturer at the University of Texas, Dallas. Dr. Wortman, welcome to The Rational View.
Thank you, Dr. Scott. And can we call each other by our first names?
Please, that would be great.
Okay.
So thank you, Marc, for sending me a copy of your book to read, to prepare for this interview. It was really interesting, amazing work.
Thank you.
Could you tell me a bit about yourself and how you became interested in the story of Admiral Rickover?
Sure. Well, first, thanks for your interest, and I'm glad to be here with your audience, which, like me, cares greatly that scientific viewpoints, rational viewpoints, come first. We've tended to discount rationality to our great detriment, and so you're doing a great thing here.
Thank you.
So, as you mentioned, I have a degree in comparative literature, and what I'd say is I have a sort of a general humanities, deep humanities background. I've done a lot of journalism, and I'm only minimally an academic. But what I have written are books of narrative histories that are sort of biography and character driven in military history, American military history. And most of my books have, just in the nature of military history, there's a deep involvement with technology. Whether you go back to a book I wrote about the Civil War, in which railroads played such an essential role, the American Civil War, or another book that I wrote called Millionaires Unit about a pioneering squadron of aviators during World War I, who were using also a brand new technology, little understood, and that ended up transforming, American power and world history, of course. And so I was in consultation with people, the editors of a series. It's The book is part of a series called Jewish Lives. The series looks at everybody in Jewish history, sort of major figures in Jewish history, from King David to Karl Marx, Sigmund Freud, theologians, scholars, Moshe Dayan, Barbara Streisand, the Marx Brothers. And because of my background in military history, they had an interest in getting something on Admiral Hyman Rickover. Now, I knew some about Rickover. I can't claim to have been an expert in what he had done before. Anybody who grew up in the 60s and 70s heard his name. He was at one point the most famous naval officer in the world. But I didn't know really this extraordinary story of his life, and then, of course, the legacy that we live today. He was a Jew from what's called a shtetl, a Jewish, small Jewish town in Poland, in what was then Tsarist Poland. He was born just before the turn of the century, and emigrated, as did hundreds of thousands of other Jews, to escape anti-Semitism, violence, and poverty, and to freedom in the United States. Came through Ellis Island, lived the, in many ways, classic immigrant story. He sought an education, got very lucky because there was he was expected to at age 14 to leave school and work full time to help support his family. He was living in Chicago at the time. He managed to get a job with Western Union, worked full time at night while he went to high school during the day, and always regretted that he didn't have more time to study. But he did fairly well in high school, and then got lucky because there was a tenant in his family's apartment who was on the draft board in World War I. And this was in around 1917, 1918. And he worked a deal with somebody who wanted to get his son out of the draft in return for that person using his influence with the local congressman to get his young Hyman Rickover into the Naval Academy. Hyman Rickover went into the Naval Academy in 1918. Had basically not seen the sea since he had traveled in steerage to come to the United States. Managed to go there and faced, significant anti-Semitism. He hated the Naval Academy.
Yeah, that's a common theme throughout your book. Is he's really seemed to be at war with the brass, the Navy brass. He hated the hierarchy.
Yeah,
and he wasn't afraid to show it either.
Yeah, and he wasn't afraid to show it. Yeah, so this is a guy who, on the one hand, was tremendously grateful for the opportunity that the Navy gave him, and on the other, absolutely despised everything that went on in the Navy. And yet, and as you said, he ended up at war with the Navy, a lifetime war. He started in 1918. He was in the Navy until forced out in 1981. So you're talking about an incredible stretch of time, and for the guy who is as little likely to become the longest serving officer in U.S. military history as could be.
He seemed like he was quite an abrasive fellow too, from what I read, but an extremely hard worker, and like he was very focused, and he didn't spend much time on luxuries or social stuff. He was very work focused.
Yeah, he was an ascetic guy. He didn't, and an acerbic guy. He lived a very modest life. He and his wife lived in an apartment on Connecticut Avenue in Washington, D.C. He never learned how to drive. He once the nuclear program started up, he was basically working 7 days a week. Nobody ever outworked Rickover, and he expected everybody who worked for him to work from 8 in the morning until 6 in the evening, 6 days a week, and often on Sundays. And again, nobody ever outworked him, even at that pace. And he had an almost priestly devotion to work. He wrote a lot of. He had a philosophical side to him. He wrote a lot of essays and speeches where he talked about work and simply the love that he felt for work and for having something that was meaningful. And he was forever grateful to the United States and even to the U.S. Navy for having given him such a purpose in life. But that purpose was coupled with an incredible hatred for what he saw as irrationality, bureaucracy, and simply lack of intelligence within the Navy and the Defense Department, which led.
He had very little patience for ineptitude.
Yeah, and that impatience and even his son of a bitchness, if I can coin a phrase there, fed into his drive for perfection. So we haven't really talked about what he actually did. So
yeah, it was a fascinating story, and before you start, I knew the name Rickover, and I knew he was associated with the nuclear navy, but I had never really explored the story. So this was very interesting to learn about what he had done and how he got it done, and his ongoing battle with just about everybody around him throughout the process. So go ahead and tell us what he accomplished.
Yeah. So let's talk a little bit about the history of nuclear reactors. So prior to World War II, going back to the late 1930s, there was beginnings of sense that you might be able to split the atom, and if you could release a tremendous amount of force. I mean, we're talking, relative to a molecule of any fossil fuel, whether coal or oil, cracking a single uranium isotope nucleus releases many millions-fold more energy. And there was this dream that you could, if you could capture that release of energy, that you could use it to boil up steam in the same way that you use oil or coal to boil steam to drive a turbine, which could be used to power, everything from a ship to a power reactor for generating electricity. But the between concept and actually creating a reactor was a tremendous leap. But there were the beginnings of efforts to do that. And prior to World War II, there was a discovery that nuclear fission took place. In a chain reaction, that you didn't just break down one nucleus, but that nucleus released energy that hit other nucleuses and caused them to break down. and you could create this chain reaction of fission chain reaction that could basically create a continuous cycle of energy being released. There's tremendous force contained within the nucleus, and that immediately created two possibilities. One is an uncontrolled release of energy, which would be a bomb, and then a controlled release of energy, which could potentially be a nuclear reactor. So prior to World War II, the Navy had actually started some investigations of harnessing nuclear fission, with the idea that one day they might be able to turn that into an energy source for driving its ships or boats. But along comes World War II, the drive to create the atomic bomb takes over all research efforts in the United States. The Manhattan Project, centered in Oak Ridge and Los Alamos, becomes the focus of investment and scientific efforts. And nuclear reactors that were created then, started being created then, were all very massive experimental, what were called piles, because they used graphite bricks piled up in these great quasi-pyramids or cylinders, in which they would set off a fission reaction and then study what happened. And primarily this was being used to eventually to generate additional fuel to be used in atomic weapons. So we come out of World War II, of course, with the incineration of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, and the basic concept of chain reaction, nuclear fission chain reaction, is a bomb. And this is of course, a very scary thing. And this is what predominates in the public mind, as it should. And it also predominated in development efforts in the United States. Excuse me. Almost all of the investment post World War II was going into the race to build more atomic weapons. The expectation was, as the Cold War unfolded, that and as did happen, the Soviet Union would get the bomb, and the United States wanted to be well ahead in its arming of itself. So you come out of World War II. During World War II, Rickover actually, who was by then a captain in the U.S. Navy, had headed up what was called the electrical section. He was an electrical engineer got training as an electrical engineer at Columbia University, which he considered to be his first real education. We mentioned about his unhappiness at the Naval Academy. He considered that the education he got there essentially worthless, because it was a rote education. Memorize situations and what procedures you would undertake, and prepare for ship command. Well, nobody wanted this 5'6" 125-pound Jewish immigrant guy with an abrasive personality to be a ship's commander. He quickly realized he was never going to get the command that he wanted, adding to his hatred of the Navy. And so he ended up becoming an engineering duty only officer, and during the war headed up the section that was responsible for all electrical systems on ships. And he did brilliantly at it. He created an engineering organization within the Navy, in which he essentially banned uniform, in which he said, the youngest junior officer who knows more about something is more valuable than the highest ranking admiral. And so he banned rank and uniform within his organization. He also set up training programs, essentially a flat R&D organization within the most hierarchical institution in perhaps the world, or certainly within the United States. And then he came out of World War II essentially not knowing what was next. But he got asked to participate over the objections of many people who disliked him in a Navy effort to understand a little bit more about nuclear reactors. And so he went with a group to Oak Ridge, Tennessee, the headquarters of the Manhattan Project, where there were, as I'd mentioned, a variety of experimental nuclear reactors, these massive piles, which the idea of sticking a nuclear reaction inside of a hull seemed crazy. Common concept was you're going to blow stuff up, and you're going to shoot out radiation. You can't possibly stick this into a ship. And then on top of that, you have these gigantic piles, and you need, whether it's a submarine or a ship, you can't weight it down like that. You can't have this massive thing that weighs so much that it unbalances the ship or boat and makes it impractical as a vessel for going underwater or over the surface. And then, of course, you're talking about ships and boats that are in the most treacherous conditions on Earth. You're going deep under the sea, under massive pressure. You're going over the surface of water where waves can often be 50 foot high. You're putting them into combat potentially, and so so they have to be able to withstand tremendous forces that and even be prepared to be turned completely upside down. So you're talking about conditions that nobody really thought they'd ever be able to truly develop a practical nuclear reactor.
Yeah, there was no real belief that he would succeed in this project, right? And there weren't civilian nuclear reactors at the time that he started this project. There were no power reactors out there. There was just bombs and piles, and a bunch of physicists at Los Alamos that weren't really going to be engineering anything.
Yeah, and then there were nuclear engineers at Argonne Lab in Chicago who did manage to use a pile to light a few bulbs, electric bulbs, for a few seconds, a few light bulbs. But other than that, there was no real belief that you could use a nuclear reactor to harness it for practical energy.
So the story was pretty good. Like, how did he get the budget applied post-war when there was so much debt? How did he get the budget to run this program post-war without it's no longer on a wartime footing? Why did the U.S. decide to fund this effort?
Well, first of all, it was a very small effort to start with. You're talking about 9 guys who went to Oak Ridge to study. And he, as was Rickover's way, he put himself in charge of them and he basically started looking at this stuff and saying, well, what can we do to practically build an actual reactor that could be put into a boat? And he wasn't one to mess around with anything impractical or academic. He wanted to see, could we actually do this? Now, returning from Oak Ridge, you mentioned budgets. So the Navy basically was in a fight for its very existence, let alone for a budget for nuclear power. Coming out of the war, you had atomic bombs. What's the use of a Navy in a world where militaries would have atomic weapons. Navy ships couldn't carry those weapons. Aircraft carriers, atomic bombs were too big to be transported on an aircraft carrier, and all of the atomic weaponry was placed under the control of the Air Force, and that's where the big budgets were going. So Rickover was actually, after he came back from Oak Ridge, was relegated to a back hallway at the Navy's. Back then, the Navy was headquartered around in these old buildings. I can remember, I grew up in Washington, D.C. I can remember these buildings. They ran along the reflecting pool, which is between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Memorial on the Washington Mall. And there were buildings that lined it, these old decrepit buildings that the Navy was headquartered in. And he was relegated to a back hallway in an office that was carved out of a former ladies' restroom. He never let the Navy or anybody else forget it. He had the toilet fixtures were still in the walls. So, and, in later years, they wanted to give him better quarters, and he refused them because he didn't want contractors to think that they could fleece the Navy and make big profits off of them. And he also didn't want his workers to think that they were something important. He said, what mattered was the work that they were doing. They shouldn't be distracted by things like nice desks and fancy carpets. And so he kept this sort of very spare working life going. But as you mentioned, there weren't budgets. Well, coming out of World War II, gradually the Cold War heats up, and the Soviets drop a bomb, and they develop their bomb faster than the United States expected, and the thought was, we should be trying to develop everything we can to counter the Soviet threat. And one of the ideas was, okay, could we develop a reactor to put into a submarine? Because if you can, let's recall what submarines were at that point. Submarines were essentially submersible surface ships or boats. They ran on the surface on diesel fuel. Then, if they got into a combat situation, they would close their hatches and go underwater, where they would run on batteries that had been charging while they were on the surface. They had these mattress-sized batteries within the boat. Those batteries allowed them to operate underwater at high power for a few hours, at low power maybe for a few days maximum. And so it's not surprising that the submarine services for all of the forces during World War II on a per capita basis lost more men than any other service branches. It's very dangerous work. But these submersible boats, in theory, if you had a nuclear propulsion, could become effectively underwater satellites. They would not have to resurface or refuel for months on end. And so that had the potential to be a strategic game changer in the thinking of military experts. So the Rickover, because of his abrasive personality, because of his work drive, and because of the knowledge that he picked up in Oak Ridge, was placed in charge of the Navy's effort to develop a practical nuclear reactor. Again, most of the people within the Navy just thought this is never going to happen. And this is sort of a way to get Rickover out of our hair. Well, you don't give Rickover a bone that he isn't going to chew all the way down. And so Rickover got into this unique position. After World War II, the Atomic Energy Commission, what was a precursor of today's Department of Energy, was created. It was a civilian branch of government that had charge of all uranium in the United States. And its essential role was controlling uranium and its use in developing nuclear fuel, whether it was for bombs or any other use.
And mainly it was for bombs at that point.
At that point, it was almost entirely for bombs. And then they had this small budget that was set up for budget and division that was set up to study nuclear reactors. And Rickover managed to be set up as the Navy officer, captain still, in charge of both the Atomic Energy Commission's division of nuclear propulsion and the Navy's Naval Reactors division. So he had two hats. He was a civilian, controlled the civilian operation, and he controlled this naval operation, all under one roof. It was called Naval Reactors. And he suddenly had his own fiefdom. And he started with small budgets from both the Navy and from the Atomic Energy Commission, and he would do things like write himself a note on Atomic Energy Commission letterhead saying, "We're going to budget so much money for the development of a nuclear reactor for a naval vessel, and we hope that the Navy will match that money." And then he would receive that on the Navy side, and he would go over to the people who controlled his budgets, and he would say, "Hey, it's going to be really embarrassing if the Atomic Energy Commission has budgeted this money and asked the Navy to match it, and you're not matching it." And he would basically go back and forth like that, building up his budgets. And he developed a timeline for getting a practical nuclear propelled submarine to sea. And he said by January 1950, or rather by 1955, we're going to put a nuclear propelled submarine to sea.
And that was a relatively short timeline. That was like 8 years, I think.
Well, you're talking about from start 1948. You're talking 7 years, and from the time they actually got. So you in the Navy, you can't get a new uniform approved in 7 years. And the idea that you would actually get this entire new propulsion system in a submarine to sea in that time seemed outrageous, impossible. So, and if you think about the things that had to be done to do that, they had to figure out how to create within a shielded vessel, within a container that was not so heavy that would make the submarine not buoyant, and yet would be sufficiently shielded to protect 100 plus sailors and officers who were standing within feet.
And it had to be so robust to withstand combat situations and high seas. It's really, jumping way ahead in the engineering of nuclear stuff, because there just wasn't anything but loose collections of graphite bricks at that point, and chunks of uranium, enriched uranium. So, but he was really good at doing the politics of keeping his project alive. Like he really knew how to run the politicians and keep his position against the Navy, who were trying to kick him out. It seemed like the Navy was trying to run him out of town continuously, but he had these connections in politics that kept him kind of like a lifeline. That was quite an interesting part of the story.
Yeah, exactly. I call my book Admiral Hyman Rickover, Engineer of Power, because it's both forms of power: power as energy, and power as political power. And he knew how to engineer power in Washington. So, as I mentioned, first there was that his bureaucratic power, both within the Atomic Energy Commission and the Navy, and he effectively had divorced himself from the Navy because he put himself in the position of, where once you came into naval reactors, uniforms went out the door. You couldn't, he said, you come to naval reactors, we throw away the Navy Book of Regulations. The Navy would ask him for things like organization charts, and he would send back, fill it out with Chinese characters. He had no interest in anything to do with the Navy controlling what he was up to. Admirals came in there, and he expected his ensigns to argue with them. His main source of power were his friends on Capitol Hill. So Rickover, during the course of developing the first nuclear reactors, he had prototyped his first reactor in what you could call a land submarine, a hull that was built inside a giant bathtub up in the high deserts of Idaho. And in some ways, the Kitty Hawk moment of nuclear power came in 1952, when they operated this reactor, which drove a propeller and a propeller shaft with a water wheel at the end of it to simulate the driving through the ocean, and ran this thing for 100 hours at almost full power the entire time. There had never been a submarine underwater at full power for 100 hours in history. And he did this in the high desert. And meanwhile, at General Dynamics Electric Boat in Connecticut, they were building the hull of what was to be called the Uss Nautilus, both a name that's had a long tradition in the U.S. Navy, but also harks back to 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea. Which was the science fiction vision of a submarine that could operate continuously on electrical power from some unnamed source under the sea.
Yeah, that was quite an interesting juxtaposition. Kind of came together.
Yeah. Well, and so they would sometimes mock the captain who was designated to be the first captain of the Nautilus. They would call him Captain Nemo. Mockingly,
of course. Yeah. He seemed to enjoy antagonizing people. Some say that from your book, you were saying that he kind of ruled through fear, and he would, spout obscenities at people that, for almost no reason. I love the stories of his officer interview technique. Could you share some of that?
Yeah. Never forget that. Rickover was a tough kid from the streets of Chicago. This was a guy who was self-made, hardball, hard-nosed guy. And he had fought his way for everything he got. And he was obscene. He could swear up a blue streak. He said that the more I like you, the longer I'm with you, the more I'll swear at you, the harder I'll be on you. And that started for anybody who got into his system. It started with his interviews. especially for young naval officers. He would bring them to the out of the Naval Academy as young naval officers, and he didn't want experienced naval officers because he didn't trust the Navy. He thought once you've been sort of inculcated and indoctrinated into the Navy way, you've been ruined as far as he was concerned. And so he would bring these these senior midshipmen from the Naval Academy, and he also started bringing regular college ROTC, Naval ROTC, Reserve Officer Training Corps candidates in for interviews. They'd come to his office. They would get there from his subordinates would test them in scientific, mathematical areas, and then at the end of their day at naval reactors for candidates to become nuclear trained officers, they would come into his office. And you're talking after he had. We didn't talk about this, but the Navy tried to force him out. They tried to retire him and force him out in the midst of creating the first nuclear vessel. And he enlisted Congress. Congress went after the Navy. Navy was finally forced to promote him. He became an admiral. So you're talking about these young guys coming into the office of this famous, fierce admiral. And the first thing they do, they'd sit down on this chair, and he had cut the front legs off the chair, and they would start falling to the floor, sliding off the chair to the floor. And then he'd start peppering them with questions. And he had this highly unorthodox, sometimes abusive way of questioning these young men. He'd ask him, until he was finally forced to stop, he'd ask him about their sex lives. He'd ask him, define religion. Tell me what the last 10 books you read were and what was valuable in them. And he would pepper them with these questions. And then he would try to get them to answer as quickly as they could. He wanted short, direct answers. He didn't want, as was made very clear to them, any BS. And then if they tried to mislead him, if they didn't answer the question in the way that he thought was right, he would banish them to a broom closet. He would send them off to go sit and stew in a broom closet with mops and buckets and cleaners, and sit there for an hour or two. And then he'd call them back in, and they'd have to answer that question. If they didn't answer the question the way he wanted, he'd banish them again. For some, this interview process had an extraordinarily valuable effect on their lives because it forced them to think. It put them on edge. He was looking for people who could react under a high pressure situation without becoming flustered, who could think clearly, quickly, rationally, and respond in a command situation without losing their cool, or if they did lose their cool, do it in a way that made sense. Because these were people who were going to be put in charge of nuclear reactors. And these were his babies. And these nuclear reactors, he expected to be able to operate under all kinds of conditions, and there were always going to be incidents. There were going to be things that go wrong. How do you react? Do you know how to react and get through this? So some would be banished to the closet and hate it. They would think this is the most degrading thing that's ever happened to me. They'd hate the admiral. He didn't care if they hated him. And they'd want nothing more to do with it, with the nuclear navy. But most of these young men, they wanted to get into the nuclear navy because they knew this was the future of the service and they wanted to be part of it. One of those who reacted well was Jimmy Carter, a young officer, brilliant officer who'd done very well at the Naval Academy. Rickover said to him, asked him, "Did you always do your best the Academy. This was after they had discussed opera, they discussed his favorite books, and Carter reflected about that, and then he had to honestly answer, because he had been in among the top graduates at the Naval Academy, and he said, "No, I hadn't." Carter was a very earnest man, and Rickover looked at him and said, "Why not?" And then he turned his back on him. And Carter realized after a little bit that was the end of the interview. He walked out. Carter ended up writing his campaign autobiography when he ran for president, and titled it "Why Not the Best," because of this encounter with Rickover. And he said that Rickover, other than his father, was the most influential man on his life. And they ended up, when Carter was in the White House, having a very close relationship. This Jew from Russian Poland was welcomed in the White House, and it's sort of an unbelievable trajectory for.
He's small of stature, but legendary for his presence, and his anecdotes he's quite bigger than life. And so I didn't realize the extent of the impact of his naval reactor program on the civilian nuclear program until I read your book. His group was basically the first to do the metallurgy and the chemistry of uranium, and they came up with the Zirc alloy coating of the fuel that's used in all of the world's reactors now.
Yeah, the pressurized water reactor, which is, remains the standard. When they started, they didn't know what is the best coolant, circulating coolant for this. There was a thought, let's molten salt, mercury, a gas, and he was the one who realized pressurized water was by far the best system, even though it didn't necessarily heat up to the level that you could with something like molten salt. It was much safer. Water is everywhere. You could shut it down very rapidly. And as you mentioned, with alloys, when Rickover started, there was about a shoebox full of refined zirconium in the world. And it cost back in the early 1950s, it cost $3,000 a pound for it. And he needed tons. He needed tons. And he created an entire zirconium industry, and drove the price down to $5 a pound. And now zirconium, we have all these little bracelets and whatever that people wear. The alloys of zirconium are still used in nuclear reactors. So he took the designs for a large ship reactor with the idea that they were going to be creating a reactor that would be large enough to power a large surface ship, and took that, and he was tasked by the Atomic Energy Commission to develop a reactor for civilian use. And in 1957, the first fully civilian atomic utility plant went online above Pittsburgh in a place called Shippingport, developed by Rickover. And this became under Eisenhower's Atoms for Peace program, the university for the development of the civilian nuclear power industry. And even the Soviets were invited in to see how it was done. And this spread basically the gospel of nuclear energy. Rickover would have liked to retain control of the civilian nuclear power industry, but quite deliberately they kept him out of it. They didn't want military control over a civilian industry. The fact that Rickover did not get control led him to fear. He always feared the profit motive and thought, we're going to get people who are more concerned about keeping their costs down than they are about safety. And in the end, he was right. He was right. And you notice that since 3 Mile Island, there has been no significant radiation release in the U.S. nuclear power industry. And that's in part because after 3 Mile Island, they brought in Rickover's naval reactors and asked them to consult on methods and operations. And they then created industry boards that were fully staffed. The entire staff came from former naval nuclear officers. And they started instituting the kinds of training, controls, inspections, continuous training, and systematically set up the same sets of conditions that have allowed the Navy, after 60 years of operations, more than 60 years of operations of nuclear vessels, probably on the order of 10,000 years of naval vessel operation, over millions, hundreds of millions of miles at sea, that there has never been a single nuclear incident involving a U.S. vessel, which can be traced to these methods that were put in place by Admiral Hyman Rickover. I've spoken to any number of naval officers, including John Richardson, the former chief of naval operations, who became chief of naval operations from under President Obama after he had been the head of naval reactors. And basically it's Rickover's legacy. It's Rickover's legacy. It's permeates naval reactors, permeates the Navy now. We haven't talked about the reforms that he forced on naval education. He took the Naval Academy that he hated and forced it to become a major engineering center. Today we think of the Naval Academy as kind of an MIT for the Navy. And that's because Rickover forced through curriculum reforms so that he could get the officers that he wanted for the nuclear Navy.
And his fight for higher science and math standards and training up nuclear Navy officers even spilled over into educational reforms for the whole country that he was pushing. Like, did he have an impact on the educational standards at large?
Absolutely. Yeah. So Rickover, during his career, as busy as he was, often working together with his wife. We haven't talked about her. They were really partners. She was a brilliant woman. He said the smartest person he'd ever met. He wrote, I think it was 3 or 4 books about education. They were often a little bit over the top. He would claim that he had studied, Russian education closely, that he had visited Russian classrooms. He did go to Russia in the company of then Vice President Richard Nixon, but he probably didn't see a single classroom. But he nonetheless actually rightly claimed that the Soviets were getting ahead of the United States in technology because of their focus on STEM education. And their insistence upon standards. So Rickover advocated the establishment of national standards for education and pushed hard for STEM, science, technology, engineering, mathematics education, and wanted to see much greater centralization of standards. And that eventually led helped to lead, because there were, of course, other people working down these lines, to the creation of what became the Department of Education. Jimmy Carter created the Department of Education. Again, somebody who came out of the naval nuclear propulsion training, and of course a real acolyte of Rickover's. So yeah, he had a big impact on public education in the United States. He'd say things like, to be undereducated in a trigger-happy world is to invite catastrophe, and we can certainly see the cost of poor education when people lose their ability to look at evidence, analyze it, understand that even if you don't like what it says, that you have to deal with the realities of the world. And we have many irrational people who are foisting their views on others, and we don't have enough people who have the ability to look and question and explore, so that they can come up with rational truths and accept those rational truths.
You're preaching to the choir here.
Yeah, I understand, but hopefully that message gets spread to others.
Yeah, no, this is good. It's quite interesting to see all the stuff that he was responsible for. He was driven, and it seems like he never slept. He inspected every ship. He had a team of inspectors that would go around. His quality control stuff. I work in the space agent industry. You can see a lot of the quality control stuff that he brought on to bring these nuclear reactors and keep their safety standards up. You can see a lot of that stuff in how we build space instruments, the quality inspections, the on-site. He sent his team on site to the contractors to ensure that the standards were kept up, no corners were cut. He was very hands-on and micromanaging every aspect of the delivery to get these things. And his first prototype sub, the Nautilus, was basically a fully functioning system that worked right out of the box. Amazing. I mean, it kind of had to, or else the program would have been shelved, I think. So that focus and determination was basically built the nuclear industry that we have today. So we're getting towards the end of our time slot here. One thing I wanted to touch on, you quoted him as saying that the nuclear navy was a necessary evil, and he was actually in favor of nuclear disarmament. And I think that is something like, he said you could just sink them all if you could get rid of nuclear entirely. Can you expand on that?
So this was, at the end of his career, and he was finally forced out in 1981 by President Ronald Reagan, who I think sort of sadly unleashed some of the irrationality that plagues the United States. But Rickover, at the end, he would regularly testify throughout his career. He was invited up to Capitol Hill to testify, and he was asked to basically speak about anything that interested him. There was a lot of course, they wanted to focus primarily on the Navy and the nuclear Navy, but he would expound on philosophy, his philosophy in various areas. And in his last testimony, he did say, if I could, I would sink them all. And he said, the Navy asked me to do a job, and I did it to the best of my abilities. His basic notion was that nuclear energy was a Pandora's box. He said that all the way back in the 1920s when he first heard about it. Or I should say it was in the 1930s. And he understood this is a dangerous power. It's a dangerous power in the hands of people who sometimes don't know how to handle this dangerous power. And if were we in a world in which nuclear energy disappeared, we would be better off for it. But you're talking about something that can't happen. This is the kernel of the universe, and so for him to say that in many ways was to say, I wish we lived in a better, safer world in which nobody had the opportunity to exploit nuclear energy.
And this was in, the height of the Cold War, when the major powers had their mutual assured destruction philosophy of, if anyone fires, we'll destroy the world. And that obviously kind of flavored everything about nuclear at the time. And there was huge protests and disarmament marches and the whole thing.
Well, and, when we hear Putin threaten to use nuclear arms as a response to, the West, NATO's involvement in the war in Ukraine, well, this is a really, truly evil thing to say. Ultimately, it's bluster, because he understands at this very moment there are 30 plus nuclear submarines somewhere out in the ocean, and many of those nuclear submarines carry ballistic missiles with nuclear warheads, and that as soon as he moved toward any kind of use of nuclear weapons, that it would be suicide. So that reign of mutually assured destruction, it's something awful to contemplate. It still continues, and yes, we'd like to put it back in the box if it were possible. It's a tragedy of the world that it is not possible at this point. Let's hope one day humanity comes to its senses and figures out how to eliminate nuclear weapons. But for now, that protects us.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And yeah, that's definitely a horrible quandary that humanity has gotten itself into in this situation. So I think I'm just gonna have to say thank you for discussing this with me and sharing this story with our listeners. Really interesting about, this is basically one man's Apollo program. This guy basically did the Apollo program for, what Apollo program did for space, he did for nuclear. I think is what I get from this, and it's really an amazing story. So thank you for sharing your work with us.
Yeah, thank you. If people want to find out more about Rickover, my book, or any of my other works, they should go to my website, marcwortmanbooks.com. It's MarcWortman books.com.
Thank you for joining us on The Rational View.
Oh, well, thank you for having me. I've really enjoyed talking with you.
I'm going to fire off a t-shirt for you for coming on and spending your time and
Cool.
discussing this.
Cool. I will wear it proudly.
Excellent. Thank you.
If you'd like to follow up with more in-depth discussions, please come find us on Facebook at The Rational View and join our discussion group. If you like what you're hearing, please consider visiting my Patreon page at patron.podbean.com/therationalview. Thanks for listening.